Tonight, former US President Jimmy Carter has died at the age of 100. He was the longest living former American leader. Also ahead, the deadliest plane crash in South Korea's history kills 179 passengers and crew, the youngest victim just 3 years old. The head of the airline apologises to bereaved families, but how safe was the airport where the crash occurred?
Was substantially undamaged and there was no fire, and then the aircraft hit something really hard and it burst into flames, and that's what killed the people on board.
At least 3 people die, with dozens stranded off the coast of northern France while attempting to cross the Channel. Gatwick suffers more travel disruption due to fog as the Met Office issues a severe weather warning over New Year. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30. Hello there, a very good evening, and we start with breaking news tonight. And the former President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, has died at the age of 100. He was the longest living former US President. A Democrat, Carter became the 39th US President when he defeated Gerald Ford in 1976. But he served just a single term before losing to Ronald Reagan 4 years later. The Iran hostage crisis dominated his final year in office, but it was his humanitarian work and crucial interventions in the Middle East that cemented his legacy once he left the White House. Our US correspondent Mark Stone looks back at his life and career.
He was the peanut farmer from Georgia, an American president who lived a life longer than any other.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
James Earl Carter Jr., Jimmy.
We must adjust to changing times and still hold to unchanging principles.
A man with a message that echoes still today. A man of deep faith, compassionate, honourable, a peacemaker, a healer. Unpretentious, unassuming, modest, frugal. Jimmy Carter's qualities were what 1970s America thought it needed after Nixon and Watergate and after a long war in Vietnam. But in one term, 4 years, he faced huge challenges, and the qualities which took him to the White House would pull him from it too. It was, he'd say, a presidency unfinished. Jimmy Carter's childhood shaped the person and the politician he would become. In 1930s Georgia, his mother had ignored the state's segregation laws, and so his upbringing was one of coexistence, an experience that unquestionably formed his mind and would allow him to help change history decades later.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
It was his blunt message to the white rulers in South Africa which precipitated the end of apartheid and a peaceful coexistence many years later.
Last night was almost unbelievable.
His influence in the Middle East was profound, but controversial too. The Camp David Accords represented his greatest achievement and a seismic moment for the region, bringing Israel and Egypt together. This was the framework on which he hoped coexistence in the Middle East would be built. But later, he would be among the first to accuse Israel of its own apartheid against the Palestinians. Bold, controversial, and the crux of a divide that has been exposed so deeply today. Under his leadership, the Cold War got hotter. A wary Carter ditched a key arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union. It would, in time, beyond his time, bring about the collapse of the USSR. And in Iran, students held US diplomats hostage for over a year. A rescue went wrong. American aircraft down. Carter blamed.
I've wanted to serve as president because I love this country and because I love the people of this nation.
After just one term, he was out. America, struggling economically, chose the showman Reagan and an optimism they couldn't find in Carter. And history, it turns out, would credit Reagan with many successes that could be traced back to Carter.
She gets three tablets.
And it was really only after leaving office that he began to build his legacy. With his wife Rosalyn, he founded the Carter Center, a charity with his principle of healing at its heart. In 2002, it earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. And away from the spotlight, he was a painter, a furniture maker, a winemaker, an author of 32 books, father to 4 and husband to 1, Rosalyn. Always at his side, if not leading him, and so often hand in hand. She was his best friend, his counsel, his wife of nearly 80 years. They were to be separated only by her passing, aged 96. The magic of their lifelong bond: never go to bed angry, always make peace. It was, in life, his defining principle. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
Well, this is the scene at the White House right now, where, as you can see, the stars and stripes are flying at half-mast as the news is announced that former US President Jimmy Carter has died. He was 100 years old and had spent more than a year in hospice care. Our US correspondent James Matthews joins me now live from the White House. And James, he had a tough time, didn't he, in that famous building, but a remarkable legacy afterwards.
Indeed. Jimmy Carter himself said, having left the Oval Office, that his most productive time, the time of which he was most proud, was the period subsequent to the presidency, when he set up the Carter Foundation, which did so much important work around the world on human rights, on free and fair elections, on matters of health, eradicating the guinea worm, apart from anything else. So he was a busy man whose life and whose principles were forged in Plains, Georgia, and who carried those principles forward in political life and life beyond the presidency. A man of great integrity, a man who took office at a most difficult time. America was in a bad way. The circumstances weren't great for a productive presidency. It was in the wake of the Vietnam War. There was a period of stagflation. The economy was difficult for Jimmy Carter to get to grips with. So the circumstances and the events surrounding his time in office didn't make it easy for him. But he succeeded nonetheless. I mean, there were successes in the Carter presidency on domestic and on foreign policy. There was the Camp David Accord, of which he was the architect, the Panama Canal Treaty. He laid the ground for a thawing in the Cold War between the West and Eastern European countries and of Russia. So in terms of his achievements in office, they are there. Unfortunately for him, the circumstances, as I say, were not great, and defining circumstances didn't help him in office or subsequent to his time in office. You heard Mark refer to the hostage crisis. 52 Americans held in the US Embassy, or taken from the US Embassy in Iran, and held towards the tail end of the Carter presidency. He spent much time and effort, which included that unsuccessful rescue attempt, much time and effort trying to free them. And of course, it haunted him at the end of his time in office. The Iranians held on to those hostages and released them within hours of Ronald Reagan taking over as the 40th president of the United States. So a humble man whose origins were in peanut farming in Plains, Georgia. He entered politics, becoming very quickly the governor of Georgia, and thereafter elevating to the highest office in the land. A man who achieved many ambitions in life and in work. And of course, he achieved his final political ambition. That was to stay alive long enough to vote, which he duly did last November.
James Matthews at the White House. Thank you very much. The White House, where the stars and stripes are flying at half-mast. We saw Bill Clinton in that footage a moment ago, giving Jimmy Carter the Medal of Freedom back in 1999. And the Clintons have released a statement in the last hour saying, from his commitment to civil rights as a state senator and governor of Georgia to his efforts as president to protect our natural resources in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, make energy conservation a national priority, return the Panama Canal to Panama and secure peace between Egypt and Israel at Camp David, to his post-presidential efforts at the Carter Center, supporting honest elections, advancing peace, combating disease and promoting democracy, to his and Rosalind's devotion and hard work at Habitat for Humanity. He worked tirelessly for a better, fairer world. The breaking news this evening, Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, has passed away at the age of 100. And keeping across all the reaction as it comes in here on Sky News. Also tonight, 179 people have been killed in South Korea's worst ever civil aviation disaster when a Jeju Air flight skidded off the runway at Muan International Airport. The plane hit a concrete fence and burst into flames after its front landing gear apparently failed to deploy. 5 of the victims were children under the age of 10, with the youngest just 3 years old. Incredibly, there were 2 survivors, both members of the crew, who were pulled alive from the wreckage. The Jeju Air flight had taken off from Bangkok in Thailand before reaching Muan International Airport, where it crashed on landing. Sky's Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch sent this report from Seoul, and a warning: it does contain images you may find distressing.
It was swift and catastrophic. The Jeju flight skidding off the runway at Muan Airport, crashing into a barrier, exploding in flames. The landing gear reportedly failed. The death toll was instantly devastating. The fire service say the likely initial cause may have been a bird strike.
We are presuming the cause of the accident to be a bird strike or deteriorating weather conditions, and the exact cause will be determined by a further forensic and joint investigation.
Many on board were holidaymakers returning from a 5-day Christmas tour to Thailand. Their families now robbed of the chance to hear their stories. Instead, they must wait for their bodies to be identified. The youngest victim was just 3 years old. Rescue workers struggled to search through a plane ripped apart. Their job, now sadly, a recovery operation. Jeju Air is a low-cost carrier that was established in 2005. This is the airline's first fatal accident, but it is the worst aviation disaster on South Korean soil.
Firstly, I bow in apology to everyone who has cherished Jeju Air. Above all, I want to give my sincere apology and condolences to those who have lost their lives in the accident and their families. At the moment, it is hard to presume the cause of the accident, and we have to wait for the official investigation results from the authority.
Miraculously, 2 flight attendants at the back of the aircraft survived and are being treated at hospitals. But it is the makeshift morgue, not the emergency rooms, that will soon be full. Those missing, now all presumed dead. Cordelia Lynch, Sky News, South Korea.
Well, the flight from Bangkok was mostly without incident, but things started to go wrong as the plane descended into Muan Airport. At 8:54 a.m, the airport's control tower gave permission for the aircraft to land on runway 01. But 3 minutes later, the pilots were warned of the possibility of a bird strike. And a minute after that, the captain of the plane sent a Mayday signal. At 9 a.m, the pilot turned to land on runway 19, which is in fact the same runway, but in the opposite direction. And at 9:03, the plane did land without its landing gear correctly deployed. That meant the plane did not slow down sufficiently as it landed, and struck this concrete barrier wall at the end of the runway before disintegrating. South Korean aviation officials have rejected the suggestion that at 2,800 metres the runway was too short. But a leading aviation expert has told Sky News it's likely nobody would have been killed if the plane hadn't hit that concrete wall, as Tom Parminter now reports.
The aircraft is doing about 200 miles an hour when it touches down, a bit more than that. Very little damage being done to the aeroplane as it skids down the runway, goes off the end of the runway, and then it comes to this object here.
It may have been a bird strike that caused the plane to get into difficulty and make this emergency landing. But aviation expert David Learmount is in no doubt as to what is the defining moment of this disaster.
Given the situation he was in, he carried out as good a landing as he possibly could, and when he got to the end of the landing run, the aircraft was substantially undamaged and there was no fire. And then the aircraft hit something really hard and it burst into flames, and that's what killed the people on board.
This airport opened in 2007. Satellite images show that the concrete wall has been here for many of those years, holding the instrument landing system that guides pilots in when visibility is poor.
That kind of structure should not be there. The ILS antennae, it's where they normally are. But they shouldn't be embedded in something as hard as that. That is awful. That is unbelievably awful.
Although it was still travelling fast, he believes more people should have survived.
And you can see it's level ground beyond that. There was plenty of space for the aircraft to have slowed down, come to a halt, and I think everybody would have been alive. But to have a hard object about 200 metres or less into the overrun, I've never seen anything like this anywhere, ever before.
Is there any justification for having a concrete wall like that in this area of a major airport?
Not only is there no justification, I think it's verging on criminal to have it there.
The analysis of the black box recorder could take weeks, but the bereaved families and the travelling public will want accountability over this sickening crash. Tom Parminter, Sky News.
Well, 9 hours on from that crash, this is the scene live at Muan Airport, where remains of the wreckage can still be seen. That is the back of the aircraft. Officials say the plane was completely destroyed. Only the tail assembly still recognisable there in the debris. Workers, as you can see, have been trying to retrieve the jet's flight data and cockpit voice recorders during the course of the day to try and understand exactly what went so terribly wrong. We can get the very latest now from our Asia correspondent, Cordelia Lynch. She is in the South Korean capital, Seoul. Cordelia, what do we know about how that investigation is progressing?
Well, it is very much in its early stages, and we heard there in Tom's report some of the concerns, I think, and counter theories that are circulating around why this crash was quite so devastating. I think aviation experts are saying often when you have such a catastrophic disaster like this, it is a confluence of a number of things. We heard early on about this possible collision with birds, but also questions being asked here about the speed that the plane was travelling out, around that concrete barrier, why it was positioned where it was, and critically, why the landing gear didn't appear to be fully engaged. It may well be that that cocktail of issues all contributed to what is South Korea's most fatal aviation disaster domestically. Meanwhile, the families are very much focused on that process of trying to identify the bodies. We have seen at the crash site some frustration expressed by them. It is a slow, painstaking process, in part because the plane has been so severely damaged, so charred, split in two ultimately, and only really the end of it still intact. Meanwhile, the two survivors that made it out, one is being treated in hospital. We have heard an update from him currently in Seoul. He's suffered some pretty severe injuries, including a fractured spine. We will have to see if he is able to provide more information about exactly what went on in those minutes leading up to this crash. But this is very much a nation currently in mourning, and I think we will see more outpouring of that grief later today.
Well, as we look at that dramatic and very distressing live picture of the tail fin of the aircraft, Cordelia, for now, thank you very much. Breaking news regarding the death of Jimmy Carter. Plenty of reaction coming in, as you can imagine. And we've just heard from the next President of the United States, Donald Trump, saying, I just heard of the news about the passing of President Jimmy Carter. Those of us who have been fortunate to have served as president understand this is a very exclusive club, and only we can relate to the enormous responsibility of leading the greatest nation in history. The challenges Jimmy faced as president came at a pivotal time for our country, and he did everything in his power to improve the lives of all Americans. For that, we all owe him a debt of gratitude. Donald Trump concludes by saying, Melania and I are thinking warmly of the Carter family and their loved ones during this difficult time. We urge everyone to keep them in their hearts and prayers. Reaction there from Donald Trump to the passing of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, dying at the age of 100. 3 people have died off the French coast during an attempt to cross the English Channel. This morning at around 6, the first alert was raised when a migrant boat was seen leaving a public beach in Sangatte, close to Calais. The boat reportedly ran into trouble, with several people falling into the water trying to board the overcrowded vessel. French authorities launched a large-scale rescue operation, which included several boats and a French Navy helicopter. The 3 bodies were then recovered by emergency services, as Emma Birchley now reports.
In the gently lapping waves of Sangatte Beach in France, evidence of yet another failed attempt to cross the channel. The alert came at around 6 a.m. of passengers in the freezing sea as efforts to board an already overcrowded boat ended in tragedy. A French naval helicopter recovered 3 unconscious people from the water. They were later confirmed to have died. On land, a further 45 people were helped by the emergency services, many with hypothermia, 4 needing hospital treatment. It's prompted yet more criticism of the smugglers making a profit from people's desperation.
They sell them dangerous crossings in totally unsuitable boats. It's literally leading them to an accident and to death, as happened this morning. I'll say again, these small boats are overloaded, of bad quality, underinflated, underpowered, and without life jackets for all passengers.
The latest incident comes after a flurry of crossings encouraged by favourable winds. Close to 1,500 people arrived in the UK on a total of 32 small boats over the 4 days between December the 25th and 28th, with Christmas Day the busiest of all. The recent spate of crossings has prompted the Conservatives to accuse Labour of failing to deal with the problem, the number arriving up by almost a quarter since the election compared to the same period last year. But the government says it's inherited an appalling legacy of broken border security and is investing heavily to tackle the issue.
It's very difficult to deal with these gangs in general. To some extent, it is just an issue of resources, that you can probably bring more people to justice if you dedicate more resources to things like intelligence, tracking people down, bringing them through the legal procedures. It's not necessarily clear that that's going to lead to fewer people crossing in small boats.
Shortly after sunrise, a lifeboat arrived at Dover with asylum seekers on board. It's thought the boat involved in the incident had carried on to make the perilous journey along with a number of other vessels. But it seems, despite all the risks, those determined to reach Britain remain undeterred. Emma Birchley, Sky News.
Now, heavy fog has caused disruption to flights in and out of London's Gatwick Airport today, with a warning of more bad weather to come over the New Year period. Sky's Amelia Harper is here in the studio to tell us more. We had a fairly mild Christmas, didn't we? Pretty miserable, but mild, but cold weather to come.
Yeah, we've had fog over the last few days, but next week is looking, unfortunately, even worse. We're going to see a number of weather warnings between Monday and Thursday, and New Year's Day, so that's next Wednesday, is going to be particularly bad. We're going to be seeing this multi-hazard storm event. So we'll see snow, wind and rain. We've got a map, I think, here we go, that yellow Met Office warning there, and there are a number of areas affected, so I'll break it down by the different weather types. So first we have wind. Most of England is covered by this warning for wind, gusts of 50 to 60 miles an hour inland. Coastal areas, that could get up to 75 miles an hour. With heavy rain, so that's set to affect large parts of the UK, particularly bad in Wales. They're expecting 20 to 40 millimetres of rain widely. That could go up to 80 in hilly areas. And then we have snow, so that will affect northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, around 2 to 5 centimetres on average, but that could go up to 25 centimetres in those hilly areas. And as with all these types of weather stories, Jonathan, we are expecting to see probably quite widespread travel disruption. This is the first storm event that we're seeing really since we've had Storm Dara in earlier December, and then Storm Bert also in November as well. We had Storm Dara, which was a red warning, so a lot more severe than what we're going to see. 2 people sadly lost their lives, but with Storm Bert, widespread flooding and heavy wind as well. So I think the message really going into next week is if you have plans, check the forecast and change as accordingly.
A multi-hazard storm. Yeah. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Amelia, thank you very much. Well, a moment ago, we heard from the next US president. Let's hear from the current one, President Biden, issuing a statement in the last few seconds after the death was announced of Jimmy Carter. President Biden said today, America and the world lost an extraordinary leader, statesman and humanitarian. Over 6 decades, we had the honour of calling Jimmy Carter a dear friend. But what's extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people throughout America and the world who never met him thought of him as a dear friend as well. President Biden goes on to say, with his compassion and moral clarity, he worked to eradicate disease, forge peace, advance civil rights and human rights, promote free and fair elections, house the homeless, and always advocate for those among us. He saved, lifted and changed the lives of people all across the globe. He was a man of great character and courage, hope and optimism. We will always cherish seeing him and Rosalind together. The love shared between Jimmy and Rosalind Carter is the definition of partnership, and their humble leadership is the definition of patriotism. President Biden goes on to say, we'll miss them both dearly, but take solace knowing they are reunited once again and will remain forever in our hearts. To the entire Carter family, we send our gratitude for sharing them with America and the world. To their staff, from the earliest days to the final ones, we have no doubt that you will continue to do the good works that carry on their legacy. The thoughts there of President Biden. Plenty more reaction, of course, throughout the evening here on Sky News. Now, the Chancellor has insisted that adding VAT to private school fees, which comes into effect next week, will not force huge numbers of pupils into the state sector. Our reporter, Anjum Pirbakos, has more.
I keep these every single year.
Christmas cards from grateful pupils, reminders for Michelle about the difference she makes.
And I like that one in particular from one of my students that's having a bit of a tough time.
But with VAT on fees and parents struggling to pay, she's worried that some children may not return.
I have a parent who's a childminder, whose partner's a firefighter. They both have second jobs. I have another family who have grandparents that are helping to pay the fees. They are not families that are going on expensive fancy holidays and shopping at very expensive supermarkets. They are families that are sacrificing things in order to meet the needs of their children.
Hello. Hello, everyone. But 94% of children attend a state school. The Chancellor insists that this policy will benefit those children.
Every single penny of that money will go into our state schools to ensure that every child gets the best start in life. And that is so often through being able to recruit and retain the best teachers, especially in some of those shortage subjects. And that's good for the children, but it's also good for our economy that we have young children, young people leaving our state schools well qualified and ready for the world of work.
The policy is expected to raise £1.5 billion next year. The government says it will fund 6,500 new teachers, but predicts higher fees will also force 3,000 pupils out of private schools by the end of the school year. Campaigners warn the true impact could be much higher.
I think for the majority of our schools, which are small day schools, a couple of hundred pupils where the parents are affording the fees but not comfortably, it's going to be a real blow. And it's just the first of what is going to be a triple tax whammy for our schools. VAT in January and then the loss of business rates relief in April and the rise in employer national insurance contributions. So a lot of schools are going to be finding it incredibly tough.
So far, the government has provided little detail about how they will achieve the best outcomes for children in state schools. Without those specifics, it will be difficult to see if they can achieve top results. Anjum Pirbakos, Sky News.
Now, it's been a busy Sunday of festive fixtures. Let's get all the sports news with Joe.
The Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
You certainly need to have one eye on what if this doesn't work out.
Sometimes when you do get released, it's a little bit of a dark place.
I think there's so much ask and demand from academies. You need to give them a plan B as well.
My journey into academy football showed how some of the game's top players have made it through the system. But now I want to know what happens to some of those that don't. Coming up in this episode, we hear some harrowing stories from people who fell out of football.
Do you know what? I knew he was gone.
You just can't even begin to comprehend it.
Honestly, the truth, I'd go out to the car park and I'd be having a breakdown.
Apparently Matthew says that's 200.
I've got videos of him kicking the ball forever. All he was doing was keep ups all the time, playing football in the garden, on holiday, and this, that and the other. So he'd love it. He'd love to play football, making sure he was the best he could be. That was his life.
Matthew Langton was 20 when he took his own life back in 2021. All he'd ever dreamed of was becoming a professional footballer.
The morning he took his life, he was supposed to leave work at 7 and he'd left at 5. Nobody noticed till 6. And they rang him and he didn't answer. Just after 6:30, I got woke up. I don't know what woke me up, but I woke up. I just knew straight away, I knew. I went next door to get the neighbours for help and Richie, our next door neighbour, started CPR on him. Do you know what? I knew he was gone. I just knew it. His bedroom's been untouched for 3 years. He's got his Xbox, he's got his hanging up his Mansfield stuff, his Derby stuff, his football boots. Everything's as he was, but he's not there. It's like being in a shop and someone's gone, you've lost your kid and you're forever searching. I'm forever searching for Matthew.
It's something no parents could ever imagine, but his mother Maxine wants Matthew's story to be heard. So does his teammate, Cayman Cashmore.
He was a great guy. He used to make me laugh all the time. I mean, I've got a video on my phone of Matty playing my guitar. He didn't know how to play a guitar. And he's there making up a song, and it's hilarious. It's all we have. We have memories like that, playing PlayStation, going gym. I always used to go gym with Matty. Me and him were quite similar in the fact like we just say stupid jokes and have a laugh. But then when it came to football, we both liked playing with each other, and it was great.
Are you absolutely convinced that his dream to be a footballer and the slow deterioration of that with the rejection from Derby, then the rejection from Mansfield, that had a huge impact on his mental health?
I think that was the big factor of his deterioration. I do think it coincided at the worst time ever with lockdown. He couldn't have contact with anybody. And he was working nights at Tesco. I don't even know towards the end whether he was even interested in football, but that was him. His identity was a footballer. He had nothing else. The way he processes it, that he wasn't good enough for football. So
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Thank you very much. And that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we're going to take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview. Tonight, I'm joined by the independent columnist James Rampton and the former Conservative MP who is now Chief Executive of the charity Business in the Community, Mary McLeod. Great to see you. We'll chat in a bit. Among the stories we're going to be discussing, this on the front of the Eye, their headline, Labour's plan won't ease cost of living squeeze. So that will be right back in a couple of minutes.